Well, I took a holiday hiatus from doing these videos, as you're aware, because the dates won't be exactly in sync as they were before Christmas began. I was tempted not to do any more of these, but I found that a little element of my own personal discipline was absent by not doing these, by not taking the weekly texts and putting them together in a way that Sunday school classes that I've had recently and in the past could utilize in preparation for worship. And so I do them a little over a week in advance so that people can use them in Sunday school if they like. And my previous history was to use them far enough in advance so that the dialogues that occurred in my Sunday school class might actually trigger some ideas in my mind as ways to go when I was preaching. But I'm back, and so we're beginning. These are the texts from the Revised Lectionary that will be used in churches that tend to use the Revised Lectionary on January the 28th. The first text is from Deuteronomy, the 18th chapter, verses 15 to 20. It's always good to remember that Deuteronomy is written as though these are the last instructions to the children of Israel from Moses before they enter into the promised land. Remember, Moses isn't going into the promised land with them. Some people say it's as though there are 3 sermons of Moses. Some say that there are a lot more pieces that have been pulled together like this from these last instructions. This is one today where Moses is saying in chapter 18, sort of saying to the people, don't worry, there are other prophets coming. And in this one, he says, there will arise among the Israelites a prophet like me. Okay, well, when you think of how Moses was distinct from every other prophet that came after him in terms of signs and wonders, miraculous things, parting of the sea is the one we always remember. This close walk with God, seeing God face to face, all of those things. There's nobody else like Moses. And in fact, the last chapter in Deuteronomy says that very thing. Never has there arisen in Israel a prophet like Moses. So was Moses wrong? Now, I know what a lot of people like to say is that when Moses said this about another prophet who will arise like me, meaning like Moses, that he was alluding to Jesus. Well, keep this in mind. Keep 2 things in mind here. The first is prophets really don't foretell the future. They tell forth the will of God in the present moment. And if you keep those lenses on when you read any of the prophets, you'll see that that really is where they do their best work. Now, that's the first thing to keep in mind. So, was Moses thinking of Jesus being a fully human being? Probably not. Now, that said, the remarkable thing about the providence of God is that God, who is in all times and in all places at once, as we profess in our Reformed faith, it is certainly conceivable that unbeknownst to Moses, even as he says this about a prophet that will arise, notice he doesn't say Son of God, but a prophet that will arise, that Moses had an inkling of something he couldn't quite put his finger on that would happen among the people of God, and that being Jesus. So take that for what it's worth, but these texts together are going to really highlight a number of things that Christians do think about Jesus, and we can consider this text from Deuteronomy as kind of a preamble or preface as to where these other texts are going to go. The text from Psalm 111, is a Thanksgiving text, a giving of thanks text. What distinguishes most Thanksgiving texts, say from Psalms of Lament, where people are pleading for God to help because some bad calamity has overcome them, a Thanksgiving song is usually a declaration among the congregation of the wonderful thing that God has rescued a person from, illness, an enemy, and so forth. This one is different because it really doesn't have that kind of specificity about a singular problem from which a person has been rescued. Instead, this text lists lots of attributes worthy of giving thanks to God. And we might say, in an allusion to Jesus, there are a lot of things that are worthy of thanksgiving that we attribute to Jesus. Now, again, do I think that Psalm 111 was looking toward the Christ? I don't think so. I think rather that, again, in God's providential way, that God was well ahead of the psalmist, who may have been anticipating the God who, in his full presentation to God's own people, would be all of these things. In other words, a hint of the Christ, while our psalmist may never have known that that was the actual hint that he was delivering in his thanksgiving. The text from 1 Corinthians, I'm thumbing through it now, 1 Corinthians chapter 8, is Paul's addressing the educated, sophisticated intelligentsia of the church in Corinth. Now, Corinth was a remarkable place, and the church in Corinth was probably the closest that any church could be in terms of the mix of people that were there. You know, they weren't all upper middle class, they weren't all impoverished. It was this real mix, and Paul is writing this to the sophisticated Christians. And he's taking on the issue that troubled a number of Christians, which was that some of their fellow congregants were going to the meat market and buying meat that had first been offered to idols and eating it with no problems whatsoever, whereas some of the other Christians were deeply troubled by that. The more sophisticated Christians knew that there being no other gods, that all the other gods were false. It made no difference where the meat came from. It was still good enough to eat. Whereas some of them who were less certain about God being the only God were deeply troubled by the fact that some of these had been offered to other gods first. What Paul is saying here in this text has a lot to do with how Christians in a congregation are to treat each other. Beyond our mental acuity, beyond our wisdom, there is a higher law that Paul is leading up to, by the way. There is a higher law that governs our behavior with each other. That is the law of love. So that while certain things may be okay for me that I would never think twice about, if they are troubling to others in the congregation, I forego my participation in eating meat to idols or whatever it might have been. I forego my participation in things that are troubling others when I'm in their presence. That's what Paul is getting at. Now, since he is really getting at this law of love that supersedes our theology and our intellect, the law of love is above all, we can take that lens and look at the ministry of Jesus and see how the law of love superseded lots. I always like to use the example where the woman was caught in adultery. And according to the Jewish law, and Jesus was a pretty good Jew, that woman could be stoned. Probably her paramour should have been stoned too. But what does Jesus say? You know, let he who is without sin, let that person cast the first stone. And then he says, go and sin no more. End of it. Or the phrase in Luke, the well have no need of a physician, only the sick. I have come not to call the righteous, but sinners. Or some of the parables, the lost sheep for one, the prodigal son for another. These are all things that indicate that there is a more powerful law than anything we formulate in our theology or anything we cogitate with our intellects, and that is Christ's own operation in life, that of love superseding everything. Quite a potent notion. Then in the Gospel of Mark, and notice how Mark skips a nativity altogether and jumps right into the ministry of Jesus. And already in the first chapter, Jesus has called disciples, he's healed the sick, and now he is teaching in a synagogue. Now, in looking at this text for this video today, I formulated a new sense of the whole book of Mark that I'm going to have to go through the gospel and look at. I had never thought before, although it's obvious, that there are several occasions where Mark begins a story, then there's another story that inserts itself in the middle of the story, and then Mark finishes the story. And this is one of those right here. Jesus is teaching in the synagogue, and already people are marveling and saying, well, this fellow doesn't teach like any of the scribes. He teaches with remarkable authority. Then, demonstrating that authority, Jesus casts out a demon. And then the story concludes with people marveling again at his authority in teaching. So we have this wonderful picture of Jesus who is, multitasking, we might say, and this isn't the only place where that happens, to where there are many things about the Son of God that show us the remarkable attributes of God's own self. And in this, not just conveying knowledge and teaching with authority, but in handling the hurt and harm that is within another human being. All of these things wrap up to show us that this really, for me, is a new lens for looking at the text, to see how often numerous attributes that we give to Jesus are seen throughout the Scripture as God breaking into human reality always. Sometimes we notice it, sometimes we don't. But our confidence in the faith is in this particular knowledge that God is always breaking into our moment of time and revealing himself through mighty acts and also through teaching. I'll look forward to being with you again next week.